Great to be able to meet some families and patients and just share a little bit about helping patients and families with some resources psychosocially and practically. And I think just tailing off of what my colleague Casey talked about, there's some things that she brought up that we'll dig into a little bit deeper. So a new diagnosis, so many feelings, so many difficult things. That would be a whole other talk that would definitely be warranted, but I know today we're talking a little about some of the resources that would help us. But these are just some of the few commonly felt feelings, and amidst all these feelings, there's a road in front of you, something that has to be done. So it's a time to start looking at taking action. You have no choice but to be forced in or thrust into the realm of having to take action. So moving from this, we're going to start taking action and figuring out what kind of resources psychosocially and practically can help patients and families. There's two big buckets in psychosocial resources and practical resources. Those are the two buckets I see. Amongst psychosocial resources, we're going to look at some emotional resources. We're going to look at some support resources. And then in the practical bucket, we're going to look at some logistical resources, some financial resources, educational, as well as some community-based resources. So starting with psychosocial resources, under the category of emotional resources, these are some of the things that I have found through my experience working with patients and families that I think end up being resources that can help you on the emotional side of this journey. Finding meaning, I think that's the first thing that a lot of people look for. Finding meaning, trying to figure out, why did this happen? Was it something that we did, we didn't do? I think also trying maybe to reframe it, trying to figure out something that would make better sense of it or help you make sense of this situation. Finding a place to put those feelings, the ones that we saw early on, in addition to some of the other ones that just come from having this new diagnosis. There's feelings of sadness, loss, grief, mourning, feeling guilty, feeling overwhelmed. And oftentimes, we as humans, we try to find a target for that. We try to find a place to put our feelings. We oftentimes don't find it, because sometimes, especially with cancer, there's a lot of situations where we just don't know why these things happen. But really just, again, trying to make sense of what we're dealing with, what we're facing, and trying to move forward. I think an important resource is giving yourself permission to mourn and find some space to be able to feel the sadness, feel the loss. Again, you're in that action mode, but there is a need for having to be able to find that, and it's okay. Give yourself that permission to be able to feel that sadness, loss, searching for, normalcy is out the window. Is there a different normal? Is there not? Looking at your dreams and hopes and how those have changed as well. I think on the other side, also giving yourself permission to hold on to hope. Hope is such an important concept. It doesn't mean it's lost. It doesn't mean that it's never going to be there. It can change and look different through the course of treatment and care. And depending on the illness, sometimes it waxes and wanes. Sometimes there isn't any and you find it. And sometimes you find it at the start and it changes. But regardless, that hope is going to help you, give you strength, give you a guide, and help you through that journey. I think finding or creating some sort of structure or framework is really important as an emotional resource. Finding some way, whether it be a spiritual resource, a spiritual structure, a philosophical outlook or structure. And sometimes it's just a practical structure, for example, a routine that you create. I have families who their little routine is you're inpatient, and every morning at 6 o'clock when the cafeteria opens, you go down and get that cup of coffee. And that's your routine, because that's what keeps you kind of grounded and solid. You get upstairs and then do whatever's in front of you. Your child may not have awakened that by that time. But sometimes just a simple little routine is something that gives structure and gives some sense of being held together so that you can go ahead and move forward. Developing coping strategies is another one as well. We all have coping strategies that we have developed for many things in our lives, but of course this is a situation that oftentimes we haven't faced or we've never experienced. So sometimes you have to tap into some of those old strategies, those old coping strategies. And then sometimes as you go through, you develop new ones. Sometimes you hear of things that people do, peers maybe that are going through this and have shared their experiences or what has worked. And sometimes you can borrow those. And oftentimes it's trial and error, just figuring out what it is that works for you and what is it that doesn't. You'll end up finding new strategies, and you'll end up maybe losing some of the ones that you thought in the past would be helpful to you or had helped you in the past. I think making time for self-care, I can't emphasize enough how important emotionally it is to be able to find that self-care. Again, it could be that cup of coffee. Again, it could be just taking a minute and going downstairs. At our hospital, we have a healing garden, and we have an interfaith center, and those are a couple of places that sometimes a family can go down for a few minutes. But being able to find that self-care, whether it be it's washing your hair that day, it's being able to walk downstairs, it's being able to get a cup of coffee. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate or fancy, but I think finding time to be able to do that is not an indulgence. It's not a luxury. It's something that's really important. You really can't take care of anybody else unless you're able to take care of yourself. And then redefining your sense of normalcy, kind of life path. Normalcy seems like it went out the window, but some sense of normalcy in a different way sometimes is created through the journey. You're able to find other ways to cope, other ways to move forward. Things that you didn't do before are now part of your normal routine. So eventually the normalcy changes, but it ends up being created somehow through the course of the care. And then finding meaning from adversity. We were talking a little bit earlier with some of our participants here about like finding a silver lining. And sometimes you do find that silver lining amidst the adversity. A situation that when you first get diagnosed seems very dark and maybe sometimes dismal, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And as you go through, you can eventually sometimes find that silver lining, find in retrospect, sometimes looking back and realizing that there's things that maybe have changed in your life. Perhaps you developed a new perspective on life, a different appreciation for something. You found new friends or a new support system, whatever it may be. I think there's a way to be able to find that. Sometimes it doesn't come for a while, but eventually I think a lot of people are able to find that. But sometimes we need to find meaning or look and at least search for that meaning amidst the adversity. And I think also post-traumatic growth can come from that. Having a cancer diagnosis is a trauma, and sometimes you don't feel it or realize it until after the fact. There's many patients and families that we have that sometimes it doesn't show really for years later. And something triggers it or something just comes up where they eventually realize, wow, I went through a traumatic experience. But knowing that there can be growth from that, some change and some evolution of yourself through that time. In terms of support resources, there's so many. And again, all this whole talk is not exhaustive of everything that exists. It's just kind of some of the highlights to give you some sense. I think defining your support network is a really important resource. Your network doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be little. It may look different than when you first started and before you were diagnosed. But you can find a support network. It could be peers. It could be other families on the floor. It could be people that you've met online. Sometimes people reach out to others and they don't even know them, and they find them and connect to them. It could be neighbors. It could be anybody. But finding your support network, defining it, your family, friends, whoever it may be, I think is an important resource. Identifying somebody who you can count on. And I think this is important, to be real. The person that you can actually let your hair down with, share maybe your worst fears, nightmares, concerns, anxieties. When you're panicked, you can go to that person. I think we all eventually have somebody in our lives that we can go to, whether it be a friend, a family member, anybody else. But I think being able to find that person and find somebody who's your go-to that you can just kind of be real with, because there's a lot of feelings here. And sometimes those feelings are a little bit hard to share with others when you have a child that's next to you that you're trying to support and encourage through their care and treatment. And knowing that maybe you have some worries and some concerns, but you don't want to share them out loud because you don't want to worry them. Sometimes you need a place to be able to put that. You need a spot. And sometimes finding somebody is a really important resource for yourself. Psychosocial healthcare team members. I know Casey went through some of our care team members, but I think also focusing on the ones that have that psychosocial training, social workers like myself, psychology, child life, chaplaincy, there's others, but these are really kind of the big psychosocial members of our healthcare team. Social workers can talk about and work with counseling with your child, providing psychotherapeutic interventions, provide referrals, all different things that can help you and your child to be able to get through this. So this is an important resource as well. I encourage you, if you have not met your social worker, please find your social worker or ask who it is. Sometimes we get a bad rap and people think that we're there just for something negative or because there's a problem, and that's not the case. We're there as the psychosocial component of our medical care team. And then spiritual support is important. You know, we talked a little bit about the framework, finding a spiritual framework if you do have one. But also, again, if it's applicable, finding that spiritual support. We have chaplaincy in the hospital. We have a beautiful interfaith center, as I mentioned, that has different cubbies for different spiritual backgrounds that you can actually go into and find what works for you. And we also have a non-denominational cubby as well. But it's a really nice place that you can access at the hospital. But of course, in your community, if you have a connection to your own spiritual support, spiritual care team, you can access as well. And our spiritual care team at the hospital oftentimes interfaces and collaborates with family members who maybe want to bring their own priest or their own chaplain or their own rabbi into the hospital, and then we coordinate so that they can be able to provide those spiritual support pieces at the hospital and at bedside. I think finding an advocate also to magnify your own efforts is important. You know, we talked about, Casey mentioned being an advocate for your child. And sometimes you need a little extra voice. And sometimes it may be that you feel like you're advocating and asking for what you think is needed, but maybe you're not getting what you think that you should be getting, or you're not getting to where you want to be. And I think sometimes having somebody to help you advocate is important. The person can be by your side when you're talking to your provider. It can also be somebody who maybe is doing behind the scenes kind of research or work to help fortify your statements, your requests. So I think it's nice if you can find an advocate to help magnify your own advocacy efforts. I think is an important piece to have. And then care and support for each family member. Cancer impacts everybody. It's not just the patient and the parents or the caregivers. There's patient and caregivers, there's parents, there's siblings, there's relatives who are close. We have families who sometimes live with grandparents. Other generations are impacted. Schools aren't impacted. Sometimes the workplace of a patient or of a parent is impacted because everybody's rooting for and supporting and caring and worrying about that family who's affected by cancer. So I think finding that support for those caregivers and for the people who are impacted is an important thing. And sometimes it just naturally happens, but I think making sure that we're cognizant of the needs of everybody that's involved so that everybody gets support at some point or in any way possible. Personal community resources are important. Those involve support groups and programs. There's multitude out there, which I'll get to a little bit later in the talk. There, could be a therapist. A lot of our families and patients sometimes need a therapist. We talked about this being a traumatic experience, and sometimes you do need to have a therapist or a counselor or support to be able to get through the illness experience. Peer support and mentorship is important. Sometimes it becomes naturally and kind of organically happening at the hospital or at bedside. You meet a roommate or you meet somebody down the hallway who's experiencing something similar. You run into somebody in clinic who may be sharing a similar experience or has the same doctor, and you end up talking and you get that support. But there's also peer mentorship programs out there, formal programs that can actually connect you to another peer who may have a similar experience, who can provide some guidance, some experience, some tips about, maybe what was helpful to them, and sometimes just knowledge that you have somebody else out there who has a shared experience or a similar experience is an extremely powerful tool. And then recreational activities and programs. Again, there's many programs out there, but it's important, it's really nice when possible medically to be able to balance. You do so much and you go through so much with the medical experience and the medical journey. There's, appointments, there's procedures, there's doctor's visits, there are unexpected visits to the emergency room, all those things. And being able to balance those when medically possible, to be able to have sometimes downtimes, recreational times, and some support times are important tools. Then some practical resources. There's so much in terms of things that we have to do when there's a new diagnosis. And one of the most basic things is just figuring out and learning who's your healthcare team. Hospital, which hospital am I going to go to? Which team is mine? Who's who? Where do I find them? Who's going to provide the care? In our team, for example, in neuro-oncology, we share doctors and NPs. They share the role taking care of our patients. So they come into clinic and maybe one week they'll see the doctor, the next time they'll see the NP, so they alternate. And that's an important thing for families to know, that in our setting, this is how care is provided. There's some other settings where perhaps that's not the case. So I think it's just important for you to know, if you haven't heard, who's going to provide the care? Is it always going to be my doctor? Is there a fellow doctor? Is there an NP? And I think understanding that will help you to know who's who and what's going to happen and who you're going to see. And then also sometimes, where are things located? Some hospitals have annexes. They have offices or satellite clinics in different cities. Our hospital has some satellite clinics that can't always provide the cancer care, but there's some other care that can be provided. And I think sometimes knowing where those things are is important, if it is that you're going to have to go there. Will your scans be done at our hospital? Will they be done somewhere else? We have an infusion center which is detached from where we are, for example, in our clinic, in our inpatient unit. So for a family to know where that is as well is important. Then, of course, education about the illness. Casey beautifully ran through all the pieces of what's a new diagnosis and how do you figure out all the parts that are involved in terms of having that new diagnosis. And I think learning about it through, for example, a new diagnosis teaching, which we do at our hospital, hearing about the prognosis, hearing about the treatment from the whole healthcare team. You'll hear that, in appointments, in, materials that may be provided. If your child's on a particular study, you may get some handouts as well, but the doctor could be providing that information, the nurse practitioner. We have health educators, we have nurse care managers, we have a lot of people. There's also online research you may need to do or want to do to help augment some of that as well. And then sometimes it could be peers who share some experience, as well as maybe family and friends who are helping you navigate and search for some information as well. And I think help with life tasks and responsibilities is important. Life continues. Bills keep coming in the mail. Your mail piles up. There's things that have to do. Your house, continues to need upkeep and be tended to. Laundry. You're in the hospital a long time. At some point, you're going to run out of laundry. So figuring out, how do you do that? Is there a place in the hospital? Can someone in your network help you? Is there a service you can pay for? Whatever it may be. There's some little things that in the moment obviously are not at the forefront, but they end up needing to be addressed at some point, because you realize, we still need to pay that bill. We still need to, get our laundry done, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes errands as well. Need help with. And I think in this piece, it's really important for families to know that if you get an offer of help, take it. I think that's the important piece. I think sometimes I see families that, I get it, there's so much going on and it's hard to even imagine or to just take that in, because you're so, guarded, you're holding on to everything. You're really dealing with something very difficult. But I think being able to take that in and get that help, sometimes people in your network, in your community want to help and don't know how to help. So sometimes knowing that, just hearing that offer and knowing that they can do one thing for you, cook a dinner, cook a lunch, bring you a meal, bring you a Starbucks, any of those things sometimes is really impactful. And I encourage families to try to take that help if possible. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could be one thing, but sometimes it's really important and powerful for both the giver of the help as well as the recipient. Practical things, transportation. How am I going to get to the hospital? Do I have a car? I don't have a car. Oh gosh, what am I going to do? Or, oh gosh, our car doesn't work. That happens. So knowing some of those resources, and I did include in some of the things here in this talk and some of the resources, some links, so that families can be able to click and get some additional information, some specific information. Access Services is a free transportation service that's helpful. You have to go through an application process, but it's one that's good to have sometimes in your back pocket in case you know that maybe you're going to anticipate the need for transportation at some point, or assistance with transportation at some point in the journey. Medi-Cal Transportation now offers great free transportation depending on what your plan has, and also people who have straight Medi-Cal are able to receive transportation services at no cost Taxis. Most hospitals have an emergency taxi program. Again, they're not for every day. They're for the time that maybe you did plan to get there and your car broke down. Your car doesn't work when you turned it on. You got to clinic and suddenly now the car doesn't work in the parking lot, but you have to get home. Sometimes we're able to assist with that. These are meant for emergency needs, not medical emergency needs, but for needs like that where life happens and you can't figure out what to do. So then you talk to your healthcare team and they'll assist. And then Uber and Lyft, everybody uses Uber and Lyft. Sometimes people find it easier because you don't have to pay for parking. And sometimes the fee to get there is not that bad. And if you don't factor in the parking piece, sometimes that's more economical. So just knowing that that's a resource as well. And a lot of Uber and Lyft also has kind of a medical that you can pick. It doesn't mean that it's like a medical ambulance, but it means it can have a little more space. For example, if you bring equipment with you, you bring a wheelchair, you bring a walker with you, they can accommodate that. And there's a different category when you look on the app that is for medical. Lodging. Sometimes care requires you to stay near the hospital. You may not be too far from the hospital, but sometimes it's far enough where, for example, there is a concern about counts dropping or having a fever or having an emergency. And there's some protocols where our kids are on some treatments that are very, very high risk. So we want to make sure our patients are nearby the hospital. So sometimes being able to access our Ronald McDonald House has been really a godsend for a lot of our families. It's been a little challenging, to be honest, because of COVID. There's some changes in terms of limits in the numbers of families that they're able to accept, but it's still a wonderful resource. Joe's House is another wonderful resource that you can find online that gives you a list of lower cost housing opportunities near where it is that you're looking in your area, near the hospital, whatever hospital you go to. So that's a great resource. American Cancer Society has a partnership with Extended Stay America. So that's a wonderful one as well that gives you a lower cost motel, hotel option, depending on what you're looking at in terms of area. And then of course, all hospitals have a list of local hotels that serve the area. That varies, some of them are not too bad in terms of price and some are really expensive, but it's always good to ask for that list if you think you're going to need to stay nearby so that you have options and you can choose what's best for you and your family. Then I think learning how to communicate is a huge thing with your healthcare team, with the people who are part of you or your child's care. Helps you to also identify your needs, your concerns, your questions, anything it is that you're thinking about. So I want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of communication. So communication with your healthcare team, with your provider. I think these are just some tips to go through. Trying to be organized with your questions, if at all possible. Bringing a notepad, although I know most people don't use a notepad now, they use phones, they use iPads. I still use a notepad, but everybody's different. But whatever works for you, just finding a place to put down your questions, your thoughts, your concerns, whatever it may be, I think is helpful to come ahead of time with those questions or thoughts in advance. I think providing a good medical history to your provider is important if you haven't met them or it's a new relationship. Also talking about, as you go through appointments, your symptoms, your problems, physical cognitive changes, any emotional changes you may see or any issues. Communicating those to your provider is a really important thing. Without that information, it's hard for your healthcare provider to be able to accurately address whatever it is that may be in front of them in terms of a symptom or a concern. And I think this is an important one, stating your communication style and your preferences. I think everybody's different. Some families want a lot of information, some families want a little bit of information. Some people like details, some people just want to kind of know the general overview of things. I, myself, for example, am a person who likes to ask a lot of questions. So I always announce it ahead. I'm like, just so you know, I ask a lot of questions. But I feel like at least it warns the person. Instead of going through a conversation and maybe that person's like, gosh, they keep asking questions and they're not, ending, and when is this going to end? At least they know, okay, this person's going to ask me questions. And then I feel like I can ask them more freely. And I feel like they're already on notice that we may have a longer conversation, than normal. But I find that that's helpful. And I always encourage people to just kind of announce it and just say, hey, ask a lot of questions or I have a lot of concerns. You can kind of use that statement at the beginning and then go and talk about whatever it is that you need to talk about. And I think being assertive and being an advocate for what you need. There are some times when I hear families come to me and say, I told the doctor or I told the nurse and I feel like they're not listening to me. You know, I keep asking that same question and they don't give me an answer, or I asked for this, but they're not able to, or they said they can't. And oftentimes, and usually there's a reason for it, but sometimes maybe it's not clearly communicated or the person doesn't actually hear those details. And sometimes it's maybe the provider just didn't provide the details that were necessary. So knowing kind of the communication style and knowing what you need and being able to then be assertive and speak up and say, can you clarify that again, please? I'm not sure. Or, you know, doctor, I've asked you a few times, but I'm still not hearing an answer to my question. And I know that you may think you've answered it, but just so you know, from my side, I haven't heard an answer. I'm not understanding what you're saying. I think saying that, being assertive, asking for clarification is really important. And I think on the other side of having a long conversation is also being mindful of your provider's time and resources. There's lots of patients to take care of. There's only so many doctors, nurses, NPs to be able to take care of all the families and patients. That being said, of course, everybody needs the time that they need to be able to get through and to get the information they need. But I think it's just important to just keep it in mind, knowing that there's a lot of other patients that need the care as well, yet you still need some of your own time. So it's a little bit of a balance. And then I think also knowing how to keep in contact with your healthcare team is an important thing. It's happened to me where it's not maybe in a healthcare setting, but I go and talk with somebody and then I leave and then I realize, oh, I didn't even ask, like, how do I call them again? Wait, do I email them? Do I call? I'm not sure. So I think that's an important thing also, is just asking and clarifying. How is it that, do I keep in touch with you? Do I email you, doctor? Do I call you? Is there a central line, or is there somebody else I'm supposed to call when I have questions for you and need to ask something? It's also important to know when to call for certain things. Casey talked about some of those concerns where you have to go to the emergency room versus calling. We in our team, for example, have a card that describes what to call for what. If it's a weekend evening, you call this number. If it's a holiday, if it's during the day, you call this number. So I think just knowing whether it's on a card or it's on a sign on the wall that you take a picture of, or there's a handout, whatever it is that you can get from your team is just an important thing, so that you know what to do in a routine question, as well as for an urgent concern or for an evening, weekend, or holiday time. During appointments, I think it's important, again, to bring that list of questions or thoughts to the appointment. Sometimes you can bring somebody with you. COVID made it hard because it was very difficult to bring more people to an appointment. In the old days, you could bring almost your whole family. It was different and it's changed. It's still a little bit limited to some extent, but it's not like before. We have a little bit more leeway. So we're able to have 2 parents come. So if you have somebody else who wants to come with you to be able to ask those questions, or to say, hey, you forgot to ask this, or, I think she wanted to ask you as well. I think those are the things that sometimes are helpful, because it's hard to remember everything. Even when you write something down, invariably you'll leave and say, oh, I forgot one more thing that I didn't even put on my list. So having a second person, if you're able to, is sometimes really helpful. And I think also, again, announcing, I have some questions, doctor. I know you're going to talk to me about this protocol, or you're going to describe the treatment. Just wanted you to know I have questions, so maybe when you're done, we can address my questions. And that way the doctor knows to build in that time. Now, if you feel like your doctor or your provider or anybody on your team hasn't addressed your questions or concerns near the end of the visit, just make sure to remind them if they have not. Sometimes that may necessitate a second visit or another, phone call, follow-up phone call. But it's just important to make sure that you mention that they still need to be addressed. And then also, again, as I mentioned, ask for clarification. It's important for people to clarify what they don't think that they don't understand, or they feel like they haven't heard yet, or there's just a missing piece of information. It's important to ask for that clarification. And honestly, doctors, nurses, the whole healthcare team does not mind. You could ask a million times and it's no problem. I know sometimes parents are shy about it, or they'll tell me, oh, Karla, I forgot to ask the doctor, but I was too embarrassed. I didn't want to ask anymore. And I always sometimes say, hold on, I'm going to go call the doctor and ask them if they can come back real quick for a quick question. Or let me go take that question to them, and maybe one of our other healthcare team members could come and answer it for you. So I think it's just important to know that it's okay. Ask the questions you need to ask. Ask as many times as you need to, and they will get addressed. And then I think it's just important to make sure you understand the treatment, understand the goals, understand the side effects. I've had families who sometimes have maybe not being clear about what the goal of the treatment was. Are we here for cure? Are we here for keeping things at bay? Are we here at trying to minimize, for example, a tumor, or change it so that it's easier to operate on? Whatever it may be, it's just kind of important to ask your healthcare provider, what is the goal of this treatment? What are we looking at? What's the ultimate goal that we're shooting for? And I think that makes it needs to be a meeting of the minds between the family and the provider. Then let your healthcare provider know if there's other providers in your life. Some families of ours, for example, receive some of their care at CHOC or at Miller's Children's. That's fine. But it's important for our providers to know that there's other people out there with other, for example, endocrinology is at another hospital, but you receive your oncology care with us. Whatever it may be, just important to make sure that everybody knows who's out there taking care of you or your child. And then let your provider know it's really important if there's any kind of religious or cultural beliefs that you may have that could impact care. You know, there's some families who have very strong spiritual beliefs that sometimes impact the ability to receive blood during the cancer treatment. And I think it's important to make sure that that's clear up front. And along these lines, also important if there's a language issue. Shouldn't be an assumption that everybody speaks English. If there's a need for language assistance for yourself, for somebody who's with you in your family, please ask for that so that that can be integrated into the care. I think advocating for yourself and your child, if you feel these needs are not being addressed, if you feel your concerns or your questions are not being answered, you can go to anybody on the team and you can voice your concerns. You can, obviously we encourage you to voice them directly to the provider, but sometimes for whatever reason it may not be the right thing or it's not working out. There's other people on your team who can actually assist and help you advocate and help you get the answers that you need. It is ideal for doctors and nurses and whoever your care provider is to be able to hear it directly from you, but sometimes situations merit some extra help. I think, of course, balancing your assertiveness with friendliness and understanding. You have to develop a relationship with your healthcare team. You may have to work with them for years, months, sometimes decades. So whatever it is, it's important to forge a nice relationship. You know, you don't have to be buddy-buddy, but you definitely should have some sort of an ability to have a good communication, an understanding of needs on both sides, and knowing how to access information. And knowing how best to really move forward as partners, because you're partners in you or your child's care. And communicating with children about cancer. There's a lot of great information that I didn't need to reinvent the wheel, so I'm giving you the link here for St. Jude. It has wonderful resources for being able to talk to children about cancer. But, you know, it's really important to the forefront to be honest and to be open and to include them as much as possible. They need reassurance. They need to know they're loved. They need to know you're there. You're not going to leave them. Be open with them from the beginning. It's really important for them to be able to know that no matter what, you're there. Kids know, little ones, all the way up to older kids, they know there's something wrong. Older kids obviously know a lot more because they understand what's being said. But even young children know what's happening. They understand. They know there's something off. There's something wrong. Why am I coming to the hospital? Why are they doing this to me? And it's important at the level of the child's ability, developmentally and age-wise, to be able to help explain. Kids can make assumptions. There's magical thinking. There's sometimes thoughts of, you know, I did something wrong, or my brother and sister did something to me. And sometimes that can really be worse. And it's really hard to undo that after this cancer experience. It's very difficult to undo some of that and clarify and rectify the thoughts and experiences. So it's best to start from the beginning, including them and helping them to understand what they're going through. And really, the more your child understands, the less scary things are. Kids tend to be cooperative. They tend to go through things if they kind of know what's happening and they know we're going to go to the hospital. You know, they may not like it, but at least they kind of know the predictability. There's some structure. There's some expectation of what they're going to do. Again, being honest helps lessen the worry, confusion, and then sometimes some false sense of feeling guilty. And again, this is just part of that same information online. If you click this link, you can actually get to some great resources for specific words that can be used to help your child understand cancer and cancer treatment. They learn a lot, kids learn a lot from the tone of voice that you use and kind of the way you present things. If you walk in and talk about, we have to talk about something, this is awful, that's like already making me feel uncomfortable. And just being able to sometimes speak in a way that sounds calm and feels calm, even though inside you don't feel calm, just understanding that the word cancer is going to have a meaning for a child that's based on how you help them understand and give them the connotation for that. Little kids don't know what cancer means, just a word, and you're going to give it the meaning. And if they hear it from you as their family member, as their parent, as their caregiver, it's going to have a lot more impact for them to be able to understand it and take it in as just a word that is related to what they're going through. You're going to give them that meaning and that pathway. Crying also is something that I hear parents say, I don't want to cry in front of my child because they're going to get worried or they're going to get depressed. It's okay. I mean, you can cry as a family. You can cry alongside your child. It doesn't necessarily make them feel worse or depressed or more sad. They're already sad. They're already worried sometimes. Sometimes they're not, honestly. They're just living their life and enjoying whatever you put in front of them. But having the acknowledgement that I'm sad, mommy or daddy is sad because you're not feeling great, and I hope you're feeling better. Sometimes that reassurance is just a really important and powerful tool. So I think knowing that you can cry, it's okay. Obviously if it's out of control and you're having a really rough time, take a step aside if you need to. But just some normal tears is okay, and your child may have and shed those normal tears as well that you can join together as a family. Kids can have magical thinking. It's important to let them know, kids know they didn't do this, they didn't cause this, they didn't do anything to cause this, they didn't do anything to not cause this. Sometimes, we hear, oh, it's because the brother or sister hit them, so now they're thinking that that's the cause. Or maybe the patient who has cancer thinks that because they were not nice to their sibling or to somebody else, that that's why they got sick. Knowing that it's not a punishment, knowing that it's nothing like that is really important. And that magical thinking happens throughout. It can happen from siblings, from patients, siblings, kids. I think it's just important to kind of keep your eye on that. And if you feel like your child is kind of a little bit too much imagination, a little bit too much of that piece of magical thinking or thoughts that are really not, they're misguided, they're really not based in fact, then it's important to address them. And if you need help, to please ask for assistance from your healthcare team or from a therapist in the community. And again, the information you're going to share, as I mentioned a little bit ago, is based on age and based on developmental level. So that's an important guide in being able to know how much to say. But kids, oftentimes just need questions answered. Sometimes they'll ask a simple question. There may be a lot going on, but it could be a very simple thing. So being able to just answer those questions based on when they come up from your child is an important way and an important guide of being able to kind of know what to say. And then watching your child for cues, again, those magical thinking pieces, questions, changes in behavior, anything like that are important things to look for and to seek help for if needed. Again, I've talked about some of this already, having the questions lead the conversation, help your child understand some basic facts about their treatment. We have some kids who are helpful to the nurses as they, have their port accessed, or, sure, let me give you my arm. Whatever it may be, sometimes that empowers them and helps them feel better if they're able to be part of that care. Utilizing correct language, as I mentioned, is important. You want to keep things simple if it's a smaller child, obviously a little bit more complex if it's an older child or a young adult or obviously an adolescent. Kids are going to hear those words. They're going to hear the word cancer. If they're old enough to read, they walk into, for example, our clinic, it says cancer. You can't avoid that. And not saying it and having a child worried about that, seeing that, reading that, and then knowing that no one's told me that could make them feel even worse or think that things are more dire than they actually are. So it's best to kind of address it head on and make sure that kids know. There's a wonderful resource called the Imaginary Friends Society that has some wonderful tools, some great videos that describe a lot of the experiences, procedures, things that happen to kids with cancer and helps them to best understand. And they're really easy and family friendly, they're animated, and a lot of parents sometimes say, oh, I really like that video, it was really easy to understand. It makes things a lot simple, but it's to the point and it's very accurate. And then siblings, all the things that I've talked about already with talking with kids. but also just extra reassurance that the sibling didn't do anything that caused this. Again, the magical thinking, that there wasn't any punishment for bad behavior, that they also won't get sick, because there's sometimes a worry that maybe they'll get sick, or that the parents will get sick now, that everyone will get sick. So I think that's an important thing as well, to reassure that no, it doesn't mean that we're all getting sick. And then explaining, I think, is an important piece, kind of expectations of how much time that may be needed. You know, mom or dad, or we'll take turns, we'll have to be at the hospital a little bit more than usual, so we may have to spend a few less, you know, going to soccer practice. We may be able to only go to 2, but then mom's going to go to the other 2. So I think giving expectations of kind of the change maybe in time spent with a sibling is important, and then reassuring that, but grandma's here, or uncle's here, or whoever it is that may be in your life that can help support as well. But I think just not having them worry that they're not going to see you, or having long periods of time where they don't know. FaceTime is awesome. That's a great thing, a great tool that a lot of families use now, that has helped keep family cohesion together during the cancer journey, especially when there's a child that's inpatient. Financial resources are huge. That's a big need. Potential loss of income. Obviously, financial toxicity comes from a cancer diagnosis. There's ever-growing expenses, and no matter what income level you started with, there's always an impact, little or big, large, small. It's just important to recognize that there's ways to navigate, but just recognizing that there's some changes that will come. Managing expenses are really important. You know, you got to factor in the copays, the travel costs for care. Gas is crazy. Meals, parking, personal care items, toiletries, all those things that you may need. Those are things that are not negotiable, things that just have to be part of the care plan in terms of your financial resources. And then financial assistance programs, there's multiple resources. There's Social Security, SSI, which is a great assistance for some of our families, lower income, who are able to receive some monthly assistance. There's many diagnosis-specific financial assistance programs. It just depends on the diagnosis. In-home support services sometimes assists a caregiver to take care of their child and be able to get paid some hours to be able to take care of that child. And then, of course, crowdfunding, GoFundMe is huge these days. You see that everywhere, and that's a great resource as well. Educational resources, there's a couple of handouts that I've left for you just to take with you as reference. But, you know, it talks about 504 plan, IEP. Those are the 2 biggest accommodation programs that can be put into place so that children can get, during their education, some assistance in supporting them in the educational realm, whether it be at home, if there's an inability to go to school, or at school, there's a way to be able to provide the accommodations to either modify their school plan, adjust hours, adjust perhaps the volume of work, whatever it may be. Learning the Rights Law Center is a wonderful resource as well. They're there to assist if there's any issues with educational pieces. If you are having trouble with the school, you've advocated as long as possible, you've tried to reach forward, and you're still not getting what you need, that's a wonderful resource as well that assists you in advocating legally from some services educationally. And then there's lots of scholarships for cancer survivors, which are wonderful things. And then the National Grace Foundation is a fantastic organization that helps our young adults who are going to college, or our older teens who are about to go to college. They help you figure out how to apply for college, maybe what you want to include in your cover letter or in your application. Do you want to include your cancer experience or not? And if you do, how do you do it? What's a great way to do it? Understanding financial aid, all those things. It's a really wonderful organization. I would encourage you, if you are at a point of wanting to get into college, that's a great resource to utilize. And then multitude of community resources. There's lots of resources to communicate healthcare updates as well as practical needs to community members or to your support network so that they can assist you. They could sign up to do errands for you or make dinner, whatever it may be. General Cancer Support Programs, CHLA, yay. American Cancer Society, Cancer Care, We Spark. And then diagnosis-specific support programs, Leukemia Lymphoma Society, a couple of organizations for brain tumor support. And then the Cancer Resource Portal, the HOPE Portal, that's a wonderful portal that I think all families should be able to access and should access. It's a great resource and portal where you can enter some information about what you're looking for in terms of a resource related to cancer, and it'll pop out information that's vetted. That's the best part, because there's a lot out there online, and some things are accurate and there's a lot that isn't. So it's a really nice way to know that you're going into a portal that's vetted, that's watched, monitored, and it's all good things that are coming out of there, things that are legitimate. Online patient and caregiver blogs are huge. A lot of diagnoses or cancer experiences sometimes are shared amongst people online, and that's a great way to get some support and information. Wish granting programs, general resource banks or portals. Find Help, I love that, findhelp.org. Wonderful information. Again, it's you put in the information, your zip code, and some great resources come out. Not necessarily just cancer, it's just anything in the community. And of course, crisis mental health support is really important. Our suicide prevention hotline 988 is really important to know. If you ever have that need for yourself, for your child, for anybody in your network, and you feel that there is a high risk for a mental health crisis, it's an important number to have if you get to that point. You also have 911, of course, if that's an issue, and you can always come to the emergency room if that's happening. Then information about legal issues. There's some great organizations. Leave of absence, that's a whole other talk that somebody could have in terms of how best to navigate your time off from work. Office for Students with Disabilities is a great resource at any college, providing some accommodations and support for medical absences for college students. The Department of Rehabilitation is a wonderful organization, state organization that's free, that provides assistance for people with disabilities to be able to seek a career and get some training to be able to, at some point, and the end result is to obtain a job that meets their abilities and their interests. And then Regional Center for our younger children who may have a disability or the potential for one and have one that may be indefinitely there. It's a great resource for younger children. Thank you.